2020, self-directed IRAs and UBIT/UDFI. This is the 39.6 Facebook and YouTube Live Finance Show. This is the show that teaches high earners like yourselves how to make your money work for you, so you don't have to work for your money. We talk general investing, taxes, real estate, syndications, Airbnb, paying for college, childcare, and even the car you drive. Today's episode is about self-directed IRAs. This is something I allude to quite often, I think, but haven't actually done an episode about, and some of my listeners had asked me to do one, so here we go. All right, so first I'm going to talk about self-directed IRAs, then we're going to talk about UBIT, UDFI. So first of all, a self-directed IRA is an IRA that allows you to basically do whatever you want with your money. This term self-directed is very commonly used, but has different meanings in different locations. So let's say you open up an IRA account at Vanguard, E-Trade, Schwab, Fidelity. You can put your money in any investments you want to. That would make it self-directed. And a lot of people refer to those as self-directed IRAs, or they call them self-directed accounts because you can choose how to invest your money, but you are limited to publicly traded securities, stocks, bonds, mutual funds, ETFs, etc., things that are available on the public market. You can only acquire the things that are available to you at that brokerage or that intermediary that allows you to purchase these assets. Now, you can have IRA accounts open at a number of different places. You have certain limits on how much you can contribute each year in aggregate, but if you wanted to have 5 different IRAs, you can have 5 different IRAs. It doesn't increase your contribution limits per year, but you can have them because you might want to invest some money at a certain place where they have access to a certain fund, for example, or a self-directed place where you want to invest in self-directed assets that are not publicly traded. So some people might actually have 2 different IRAs. One that is at a self-directed IRA company that specializes in private assets, non-publicly traded assets, and one that is where you have your publicly traded assets. And you can put money and roll it over back and forth between them as desired. Okay, we have self-directed IRA accounts, my wife and I, for our Roth IRAs, and we also have traditional IRA accounts there as well, because in order to put the money into the Roth IRA using the backdoor method, you have to go by way of a traditional IRA. So we put the $6,000 into the traditional IRA as a non-deductible contribution, and then immediately roll it over to the Roth IRA. The same like you would do at Vanguard, Fidelity, Schwab, E-Trade, etc. Now, once the money's in the Roth IRA, it sits in that account as cash. Then it may get deployed for a particular investment. Okay? The IRA companies don't make money on your money the same way that Fidelity, Schwab, E-Trade, Vanguard would, because you're paying them fees that are separate from the investment dollars, because those mutual funds and things, those have expense ratios that may kick money back to the to that company. When you're at a self-directed IRA, they have to make money somehow, right? They have to offset their costs and be profitable for them to stay in business. So they will usually charge you an amount based on the amount of money you have invested there in your balance that is out and deployed. When the money's just sitting there in cash, they often don't charge you as much money or money at all, maybe just like an ongoing annual fee, because that capital, that's cash sitting in there, I assume they can invest that money too, but it does have to be available to you for whenever you want to make an investment. But they're making at least probably some interest on your dollars. Now, when you invest money out, then they usually charge you some sort of a percentage or some sort of a tier structure, and then they will charge that to you. I actually pay that money from my credit card as a payment for the fee. It does not require at least where I have mine, it does not require that the fee comes out of the account itself, because if all of the money has been invested, you can have a balance of $0 of cash sitting in that account. And so if I have to pay a fee every quarter of, like, let's say $100, I can just have them charge the money to my credit card, my personal credit card, and that allows me to basically pay for the fees outside of the IRA, so I'm not utilizing money from within it. Now, what do I use my self-directed IRA for? Personally, we only have used it for debt instruments. So that means we lend the money out, for example, to a flipper. A flipper might say, hey, I need $100,000 to do this flip. It's going to cost them, let's say, $30,000 to acquire the property, and then $30,000 to rehab it. I'm sorry, let's pretend they need $100,000. So they need $50,000 to buy it and $50,000 for acquisition and rehab and holding costs. So that's the $100,000. And they expect to make, let's say, $150,000 in total. So $100,000 of it would go back to you, and then $50,000 would be their own profit. Okay, so we lend it, and when we lend it, we get a lien position. Ideally, you take an investment where you have a first lien position. So basically, if they don't get the money back to you, you foreclose and take that property back. And so, because you have a lien, you are the bank, all right? The same way that you have a bank mortgage. If you don't pay your mortgage, the bank forecloses and takes your house back from you. Okay, so you only lend when there's a lot of margin there. And when you're doing these types of deals, you can generally charge a substantial amount of interest. We have historically lent at 2 points plus 12% interest. So 2 points is 2% of the balance that we loan out, and then 12% is the interest rate that is based on how long they hold it. So for example, if I lend somebody $100,000, take a first lien position on a property, and they plan to hold the money for 6 months, because it's going to take time for them to A, they have to buy it, then they have to B, they have to rehab it, and C, they have to sell it or find a buyer, and then D, they have to actually close on that after the buyer goes through, gets the mortgage, gets it inspected, all those things. So let's just say 6 months. If I lend $100,000 out, I charge 2 points, so that'll be $2,000 plus 12% interest. So if they held it for an entire year, that 12% would be $12,000. But because they only held on to it for 6 months of it, they only have to pay interest for those 6 months, so that'd be $6,000. So they would give me back $8,000 in total on my $100,000 loan, and that's a very good return. That's $8,000 in half a year. That's actually 16% interest. Okay, and it's very clean. All the money, basically, you could send all the money up front, and then they give you all the money back with interest. You can also design it so that you give them a portion of it up front, like enough money to close and enough money for certain materials. You can pay them out in installments. So let's pretend it costs $50,000 to close down on and get the property. You might give them $60,000 up front, and then after they've used up $10,000, you could have certain schedule where you say you need to have these things done, and then I will give you an additional $20,000, and then they have to get certain things done, and then you can give them the last $20,000. Okay, because otherwise potentially they could just take all that money. They could close on the house, but then they have $50,000 of your cash, and yeah, you could foreclose on them, but they haven't done any work on the property. So people do it differently. Now, people are saying, how do you find flippers? Well, I have been a member of different real estate investment organizations, so I have different relationships with different people, a lot of wholesalers, a lot of people who flip, and so I just know a lot of people. And in these networks, there's often people who are looking, it'll be like the 3rd to the 4th week of the month, and foreclosure date is the first Tuesday of every month. And so a motivated seller will become very motivated like the week before closing, and so before the foreclosure. So they may say, I need $100,000 by Friday. Okay, and so you need to have the capital ready in your account, and boom, you can wire it. You get a promissory note, you get a lien. We do this with an attorney so that you have your name on that property such that it is secured to you. Okay, so you have some security. That's what you can do with a self-directed IRA, because you can invest in real estate assets. And this is actually not investing in an asset. You're just investing as a loan, which is secured by an asset. But you could actually buy a whole real estate asset with your self-directed IRA if you wanted to. You could buy a foreclosing house, and it's going to cost $50,000 to buy it, and you have $100,000 in your IRA. Boom, you could just buy that entire property in your IRA. Okay. Every single dollar that you would want to put into that house for rehab, however, would have to come from the IRA. You can't mix dollars from your personal accounts. It has to be from the IRA. And all the rental income would go directly into the IRA. That can't go out to one of your businesses. That can't go to your pocket. It has to go inside the IRA. But when you sell the property, all those capital gains, poof, are non-existent from the tax perspective because it's inside of the IRA. Now, you can't necessarily flip properties in an IRA, but if you have a buy and hold rental and then you hold on to it for a year, 2 years, and then sell it the same way you may do with any other rental property, yeah, all those capital gains can be tax-free. Now, in that example I just gave, you used cash to buy the entire property without any leverage, without a loan, okay? Self-directed IRAs get complicated, one, because they have a lot of rules, okay? There are certain things you can't buy. I think you can't buy like art and collectibles. And you can't work with any non-allowed parties. So you can't invest with like your parents or your children, okay? You also can't use that, whatever you have in there, for any personal use at all. Otherwise, you're violating the IRA, and you can be faced with penalties. Okay, so like if you were to buy a duplex to house hack, you cannot do that with a self-directed IRA, okay, because you can't live in half of it. Now, the problem with using a self-directed IRA for real estate investing when there's a loan involved is this thing called UBIT, unrelated business income tax. Although it's confusing because it's actually often referred to as universal business taxable, unrelated business taxable income, UBTI, or unrelated business income tax, UBIT. And then there's this other thing called UDFI, which is unrelated debt financed income. Okay, so to clarify what these are, unrelated debt financed income is the income that the IRA would earn in payment. Okay, so if you own a rental property and it has positive cash flow so much that it's taxable income, that income would be unrelated, or a portion of that would be unrelated debt financed income. And then you'd have to pay tax on that unrelated debt finance income, and that tax is called UBIT. So UDFI is the income, and UBIT is the tax that you pay on the UDFI. I know, it's super complicated. So how much is this tax? So if you buy a buy and hold rental with leverage, like let's say it's a $100,000 property and you pay $25,000 down to acquire it, then you have 75% of this is a loan. Okay, so 75% of the money that is earnings from the taxable perspective would be subject to UBIT. 75% of your earnings would be UDFI. Okay, for a rental, this might not mean anything in the first few years because depreciation is keeping the taxable income close to zero or below zero. But when you sell the property, okay, so you buy a property for $100,000 and let's say it appreciates well and you sell it for $200,000 5 years later. Well, you have $100,000 there of capital gain, okay? I'm just going to ignore depreciation completely. But for simplicity, from $100,000 to $200,000, all of that is capital gain. Of that $100,000 capital gain, 75% of it would be considered UDFI, unrelated debt financed income. And you'd have to pay unrelated business income tax on it, UBIT. How much tax is that? It's like 37%. So you would decrease your total earnings because all those gains that were made from the leveraged portion of your investment are not tax sheltered. You only get the tax shelter for the proportion that is the capital investment from the IRA itself. So it's kind of not fair, but that's just the way it is. So I have not personally utilized my self-directed IRA for any equity or ownership investments of real estate, whether it's owning a single family property outright in cash, or owning a single family property with leverage, or in a syndication. Okay, just because with all the leverage that we usually take, which is what gets your returns to where they are very competitive, a lot of that gets decreased by the UBIT. And part of the problem further is that UBIT tax can be so high that it is potentially higher than just paying like regular capital gains, at least the way I understand it. So if you just have it in a taxable account, it could be more tax efficient. So if you don't have any capital, then and you really want to do a deal and an IRA is the only place you can get it from, then sure, you could do it, but it will definitely stunt your returns. But owning leveraged real estate with your taxable account is a great place to do it. You don't need to use a self-directed IRA for this. I love using a self-directed IRA for high yield secured debt. It also gives some diversification to the portfolio. I mean, if I'm getting like 12% per year as a debt instrument, that is very high yield, and that is more so than most people are going to get on a risk-adjusted return ratio. From a risk-adjusted return perspective when investing in equities and stocks. Okay, so 12% tax-free is fantastic. If I were doing the same thing in a taxable account, however, for example, if I just lent my own money to somebody and I paid 37% federal income tax plus 3.8% NIIT, so 40.8% by loaning money, that 12% that I could be making, that ends up getting down to 7.2% basically. So you get crushed by it being taxable. So debt, high yield debt is still high yield debt, but when you do that in a taxable account, it's very tax inefficient. Whereas doing it in a Roth IRA is like the best place to do it. And if you heard other times I've talked, I don't love Roth IRAs because you don't get to tax loss harvest. And I really focus on how much can I save in tax by deducting losses. And a Roth IRA, you can't do that. If you have a loss in a Roth IRA, to me, that's a wasted loss. So if you're investing in debt instruments, your likelihood of having a loss is a lot lower, especially when they're secured by an asset worth a lot more than your loan. So you're unlikely to lose money. Like if I'm going to lose money, I want to lose money in my taxable account. I don't want to lose it in my IRA. That's just pouring salt on a wound. Okay. Now the exception is if you have a self-directed 401k, that is not subject to UBIT. I have no idea why that's the way it is, but that's the way it is. So if you are able to open up a self-directed 401k, you would first of all have to have some sort of a business to justify opening it. Then you could roll your money out of a self-directed IRA or any IRA into a self-directed 401k. Then you can invest in leveraged instruments without having to worry about that UBIT. And that makes it a lot more appealing. However, self-directed 401ks can become more complicated. Like a 401k just in general is more complicated than an IRA. There's going to be more paperwork involved. And there are not going to be as many places who have them available. Where I have my IRA, my self-directed IRA, they actually keep the money themselves. And when I want to have the money go somewhere, I have to fill out a form and send it to them, and then they will wire the money. And then they charge me a fee for that. But I personally like it because it keeps the capital out of my hands. Because you don't want to mess around with these accounts and make a mistake, because you don't want your retirement accounts to have something go wrong where now you're paying big tax penalties. Like, I don't want that liability risk on myself by making a mistake. A lot of self-directed 401ks, like the same one, at the same place where I get my self-directed IRA, they have a self-directed 401k, but they really just give you the paperwork. And then you have to open up the account yourself at some place, and you have checkbook control. They don't actually keep the money themselves. I personally prefer that they have the money themselves, and I keep the money there because I don't want to touch it. But a lot of them, the self-directed 401k companies that I've seen, they give you the documents, then you go to whatever bank and you have them open up an account for that self-directed 401k, and then you have a checkbook, and you can write a check from that whenever you want to make an investment. It's super easy, and all the distributions or earnings go right into that bank account. And you can easily write a check or wire whenever you need to without having to go through any intermediary. And it's fantastic, except you could make a mistake and screw something up, and it's on you to do all the books for that. So that's one of the caveats. But there's probably a self-directed 401k company out there who will do all of that for you and keep the money and do the transfers and whatnot. I honestly have just not looked into it that much because our self-directed IRAs are a small percentage of our net worth, probably like 10%. And we're perfectly fine just using that for debt instruments because, okay, 10% in debt, or when it's not out, it's sitting in cash. So there you have it. Self-directed IRAs, UBIT, and UDFI. Episode number 106. Again, I am not certified in anything financial, accounting, legal, or otherwise. This is strictly for my entertainment, hopefully yours. Please consult with your professionals prior to making any of your own financial, legal, accounting, or other decisions. Until tomorrow, episode number 107. Also, we are going to be doing a live Zoom session with Vina Jetty and Jordan Frey, the prudent plastic surgeon, talking about Element 41. Link to that is in the Facebook group, 39.6 community. If you're not there, please join us. If you are there, please invite a friend. And if you haven't heard it, Medicine, Marriage, and Money podcast released yesterday. Another episode with Dr. Katrina Hughes. Great episode.